Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Asia's ESG and Sustainability Landscape, Compliance Essentials for 2025. A little bit of orientation about the webinar platform before I introduce our speakers for today. The webinar slides are available to the left side of your screen, along with a few helpful links if you would like to explore and learn more about compliance and risks and how we can simplify and accelerate your compliance processes. We want this webinar to be as engaging as possible, so please do send us any questions you may have, and we'll aim to address them during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If you would like to submit a question for this session, click Ask a Question on the left side of your screen. And for any questions that we don't get to during this session, we'll follow up with you directly with an answer. And at any time, if you're interested in having a member of our team follow up with you outside of asking a question, please don't hesitate to use the Start a Conversation button at the bottom of your screen. And last but not least, the webinar recording will be sent to you within 24 hours. So my name is Orla Morris, and I am the Content Marketing Manager here at Compliance and Risks, and I'm delighted to be joined by this wonderful crowd of SMEs here who will be covering this topic, starting with Lynn Chan, a regulatory compliance specialist here with Compliance and Risks. She joined the team in November of 2022 and is responsible for monitoring regulatory developments in China, Thailand and Malaysia, and helps clients with questions about food contact materials, the transport of dangerous goods and chemicals in products. Prior to joining Compliance and Risks, Lynn worked for a law firm where she drafted legal memoranda and conducted legal research in civil law matters. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lynn.
I'm delighted to be here too. Thank you, Orla.
And also to add to that, Lynn was admitted to the Bar of Ireland as a graduate of the Honourable Society of King's Inns and studied her law undergraduate at Letterkenny Institute of Technology. Don't want to forget that, Lynn. So thanks again.
Thank you.
We are also joined by Yuko Yamamoto, Regulatory Compliance Specialist here with Compliance and Risks. She joined Compliance and Risks in January 2022, and since then has been responsible for monitoring regulatory developments in Japan and Hong Kong. She holds a Bachelor of Law degree from Hosei University in Japan and has over 5 years of experience as a legal assistant at a major Japanese law firm. Thank you so much for joining us as well today, Yuko.
Thank you, Ola. I'm happy to be here.
We're also joined by Siddhant Shahane, a regulatory compliance specialist here with Compliance and Risks, who has been working with the company since the middle of 2018. Having a master's in business law from the University College of Cork, he is a subject matter expert on Brexit-related product safety. Before this, Siddhant worked in the regulatory compliance field for a few years in India and is still very much connected to his native land. Thanks for joining us today, Sid.
Thank you, Orla. Great to be here.
And last but certainly not least, Alex Lee is a regulatory compliance specialist also with Compliance and Risks and is the primary subject matter expert for climate change, carbon footprint and climate change corporate reporting, climate disclosures. He also oversees the ESG and sustainability reporting as an associate subject matter expert, monitoring regulatory developments in several Asian countries and contributing regulatory contents to the C2P platform regularly. Before joining Compliance and Risks, Alex worked in government relations and market research in China, where he advised clients on issues including US-China relations, China's industry policy, and global product trends across different industries. Alex has a BA and an MA in political science and has studied and worked in China, the United States, Canada, and Ireland, and is proficient in both English and Mandarin. Thank you for joining us today, Alex.
Thanks a lot, Orla. Glad to be here.
So just before we kick off the webinar, I would like to provide a background about Compliance and Risks for those who are joining us for the first time. At Compliance and Risks, our mission is to ensure global companies have the tools and information to build safe, sustainable products in a world full of change. We are the trusted product compliance technology provider for the world's leading brands and have spent 2 decades honing the digital tools, expertise, and content you need to stay ahead of the dynamic regulatory landscape and prove your product compliance, protecting your brands, and helping to drive your growth. At Compliance and Risks, we have the world's most comprehensive regulatory database with over 100,000 regulations historically available in C2P. With global regulatory coverage and expertise across over 20 industries, we understand that regulatory compliance definitely doesn't sleep. And our regulatory expert team is truly global, with 28 languages collectively spoken across the team, all fortified by our 30 knowledge partners. And as mentioned, C2P is our enterprise software, the key to unlocking market access as new products can be designed and built with full confidence you've met all compliance obligations. And the power of C2P includes keeping on top of regulatory changes and their impact globally, including early warning alerts, impact probability, productivity workflow tools, and so much more. And with that, I'm delighted to hand it over to you, Lynn.
Thank you, Orla. Thank you for the warm introduction. And in this webinar, we begin highlighting key trends of ESG regulations in Asia, focusing on mainland China, Thailand, Hong Kong, China, Japan, India, Singapore, South Korea, and Vietnam. Before we end the webinar, we will also go through some key takeaways in these jurisdictions. Key trends of ESG regulations in Asia, where we are seeing a prioritization of ESG and climate disclosure. And the rapidly evolving regulatory landscape is showing significant alignment with the ISSB standards. While many ESG disclosures began as voluntary initiatives, there is a clear and ongoing gradual shift towards mandatory requirements with a strong emphasis on climate action and decarbonization. Looking ahead, the scope is broadening ESG considerations, including material-focused supply chain due diligence concerning minerals and timber, and a greater emphasis on human rights and business practices across supply chains and labor practices. However, these areas are currently voluntary or are in the preparation for potential future regulation. Adding complexity to this evolving landscape is the diversified implementation of these requirements across different jurisdictions, resulting in less cross-country coordination and potentially varied compliance obligations for organizations. We will first walk through to what's happening in mainland China. In December of 2024, the Chinese Ministry of Finance published the Trial-Basic Standard on Sustainability Disclosure for Business Enterprises, also can refer to as the Chinese CSDS. This framework aims to align with the international standards ISSB Standard 1, and it requires enterprises to disclose sustainability-related information reports. The CSDS is drafted based on the 3 components, and which are basic principles, specific standards, and application guidelines, where these will provide explanations and examples for companies to conduct information disclosure. The CSDS would also adopt the double materiality principle, similarly to the EU CSRD, meaning it will require companies to disclose on information on sustainable risks and opportunities and information on sustainable impact. Currently, the CSDS is implemented on a voluntary basis, and by the year of 2030, a standardized national system will be developed, mandating companies to disclose, and it will expand to a wider range of enterprises. Climate change is also an important aspect. Hence, in April of this year, the Chinese Ministry of Finance proposed the draft standard on climate-related disclosures for business enterprises. And this draft should be read together with the Chinese CSDS. This framework will align with the international standards, particularly ISSB Standard 2. and it will require companies to disclose climate-related information that are materially relevant. The draft standard also includes a few provisions, including that it sets a general requirement for the disclosure of climate-related impact information. Furthermore, it imposes an obligation to enterprises to calculate greenhouse gas emissions in accordance to the carbon emission accounting standards, which will be developed by national authorities. Additionally, in Article 35, it also specifies that industry-specific businesses are required to disclose information related to financing emissions, including Scope 1, 2, and 3 of the greenhouse gas emissions. This draft standard will be applied on a voluntary basis, and by the year of 2027, the climate disclosure standard will be introduced. Moving on, in December of 2015, the Chinese Chamber of Commerce of Metals, Minerals, and Chemicals Importers and Exporters collaborated with the OECD to publish the Chinese Due Diligence Guidelines for Responsible Mineral Supply Chains. And this guideline will align with the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD Due Diligence Guidance on Responsible Supply Chains of Minerals from Conflict-Affected and High-Risk Areas. This guideline will help guide Chinese companies involved in the mineral supply chains to identify, prevent, and mitigate risks of contributing to conflict, serious human rights abuses, and serious misconduct. This guideline will also apply to those companies registered in China or overseas companies which are majorly owned by a Chinese company. Included in this guideline is a 5-step framework for conducting the risk-based supply chains due diligence. And I want to bring to your attention to step 2, where it provides the identification and assessment of risk in the supply chain. There are two types of risks in this identification in the supply chain, which is type 1 risk and type 2 risk. This division does not mean that type 1 is priority over type 2. So companies should focus on identifying risk based on their severity and the possible impacts to potential stakeholders. Moreover, companies should conduct enhanced due diligence practices by watching out for warning signs, which means paying attention to the location of origin of mineral resource to assist in identifying risk. Crucially, the implementation of the guidelines is voluntary, but companies should be encouraged to adhere to these guidelines, and it will provide assurance to international partners in the supply chains. And finally, in China, in April of 2024, the Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Beijing stock exchanges respectively announced the issue of self-regulatory guidelines on sustainability report. It was enforced on 1st of May 2024, and the implementation of these stock exchange guidelines will depend on the company indices as shown above here, and the Shenzhen Stock Exchange and Shanghai Stock Exchange mandates the compulsory disclosure for the companies, whereas Beijing Stock Exchange requires that all other issuers are encouraged to disclose voluntarily. These companies will have to publish their first sustainability report by 30th of April 2026, and after that, the report should be submitted within 4 months after the end of each financial year. A few points to highlight across of all 3 guidelines. They all adopt the double materiality principle on financial materiality and impact materiality, and it has a disclosure framework covering 21 ESG topics. These guidelines represent a significant step for China in developing a robust sustainability reporting framework. Moving on to a Southeast Asian country, Thailand. The Thailand Securities and Exchange Commission's SEC announced the annual registration statement and annual report known as the Form 56-1 report. It will require listed companies to disclose further information on a company's business sustainability, corporate governance, and environmental and social footprint, including carbon emissions and human rights commitments. Although there is no specific framework required to prepare this report, the SEC have published guidelines and manuals to assist these listed companies to prepare the report. For instance, the Sustainability Reporting Guide for listed companies should be read in conjunction with the report, and this guideline will help companies to prepare on how to report this one report, and also provide specific metrics and data points for companies to consider when disclosing within each ESG area. The form was implemented from 31st December 2021, and all listed companies will need to file their Form 1 report within 3 months from the end of the fiscal year. In order to achieve Thailand's climate action for carbon neutrality by 2050 and net zero greenhouse gas emission by 2065, the Thai Department of Climate Change and Environment proposed the draft law on climate change. And this draft law was initially proposed in June of 2024, and up to date, it still remains as a proposal. This draft law will establish specific mechanisms to achieve climate change mitigation targets. Included in the draft law is a mandatory reporting requiring businesses within specified categories to submit annual reports on their greenhouse gas emissions and dose absorption and the net greenhouse gas reduction amount. There are also a few key elements in the draft law, which is the emission trading system. This is a mandatory mechanism for designated industries where it sets emission caps aligned with national targets. Furthermore, a carbon tax will be imposed on certain products at a specific point during their life cycle, and this tax will be collected from importers and manufacturers of the products. Lastly, modeled after the EU system is the CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, where it requires importers of specified products to register and report the greenhouse gas emissions of their imports and purchase carbon adjustment certificates. Included in the draft law are certain penalties for the violations, which cover financial penalties and even imprisonment. As already mentioned above, this draft law remains a proposal, but it's expected to be submitted to the cabinet approval by the end of this year and will potentially be implemented in 2026. Moving on is the Office of the Securities and Exchange Commission SEC and the Stock Exchange of Thailand SET that proposed the draft guidelines for greenhouse gas emissions and ESG reporting in November of 2024. These guidelines will align with the IFRS standards, and they provide clear guidance on ESG information and greenhouse gas emission data that should be disclosed by Thai-listed companies. And there, as you see in the slide, there are a few different categorization of companies, and they will depend on different implementation dates, whereby SET 50 would have to start reporting in financial year of 2027, while those in the group of SET 100 will start reporting in 2028. Smaller companies outside of the two SETs will begin reporting in 2030. And in relation to this effective timeline for the companies, the SEC also proposed transition reliefs for the initial implementation. And these are comparative reporting, climate first reporting, reporting timing, greenhouse gas protocol, delay for disclosure of Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. While these guidelines are voluntary, they set the foundation for future regulatory requirements, encouraging companies to adopt best practices. And finally, in November of 2021, Thailand has accepted the recommendations from United Nations member states and signed a voluntary pledge to continue to support human rights due diligence and to consider proposing compulsory measures for businesses to undertake human rights due diligence. This is evident in the publication of this National Action Plan from 2023 to 2027, where it is a guiding framework to promote responsible business conduct and includes the exploration of human rights due diligence measures. And in this National Action Plan, it mentions that it has intention to publish a draft mandatory human rights and due diligence law. Furthermore, online reports have suggested that this consultation of the draft law will be released before the end of this year, and this draft mandatory law will strengthen corporate responsibility, business compliance, and protect workers in business operations and supply chains. And the draft law will also align with the United Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. That is all for me today. I will pass the spotlight to my wonderful colleague, Yuko.
Thank you, Lynn. So now I'd like to give an overview of sustainability reporting standard in Japan. In Japan, an existing regulation was amended in 2023 to require companies that issue securities or are listed in Japan to disclose certain non-financial information. This requirement also applies to overseas companies if they issue securities or are listed in Japan. The amendment to the Ordinance on Disclosure of Corporate Affairs came into effect on 31st January 2023. It aims to enhance corporate transparency by requiring the disclosure of a broader range of non-financial information. Under this amendment, 3 new categories of information must be included in security reports. These are employee status, corporate governance status, and sustainability-related concepts and initiatives. In the employee status sections, companies shall disclose data such as the ratio of female managers, the male parental leave uptake rate, and the gender pay gap. In the corporate governance sections, companies are required to provide information on matters such as board activities. And sustainability-related disclosure items are divided into 4 categories. These are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and target. Among these, governance and risk management are mandatory for all companies. On the other hand, disclosure of strategy and metrics and target is required depending on their materiality. Regarding climate-related informations, companies may disclose Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions, but this is currently voluntary, but proactive disclosure is encouraged. This section also includes information on human capital and diversity. Companies are required to disclose such as their policies target and performance related to human resource development and workplace environmental improvement. And this disclosure is mandatory. In addition to that, on 5th of March 2025, the Sustainability Standard Board of Japan, called the SSBJ, issued Japanese first sustainability disclosure standards. These standards are broadly aligned with the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards, but they are also include the elements and options specific to Japan, tailored for domestic application. The IFRS ISSB standards are divided into 2 parts. These are S1, which set out general requirements for sustainability-related financial disclosure, and S2, which focus on climate-related disclosure. In contrast, Japan has issued 3 separate standards. First, there is the Universal Sustainability Disclosure Standards, which serves as fundamental standards. And then we have thematic standard number 1, the general disclosure standards, and thematic standard number 2, the climate-related disclosure standards. While the IFRS separates the standards into S1 and S2, Japan further split S1 into 2 distinct parts. These are the universal standards and the general disclosure standards. The universal standards, also known as the application standards, covers the basic requirements for preparing sustainability-related financial disclosures. On the other hand, the general disclosure standards include what the IFRS refers to as core contents, disclosure related to sustainability-related risks and opportunities. The chart on this slide is provided by the SSBJ, gives a clearer overview on how these standards are structured in Japanese framework. Regarding to these SSBJ standards, currently the application of the SSBJ standards is voluntary. Companies that choose to adopt them may begin disclosing information on their security report based on these standards from the financial year ending March 2025. However, mandatory adoption of the SSBJ standards is planned to be introduced in stages depending on the company size. The phased approach was discussed on an expert working group under the Japanese Financial Service Agency. According to the current plan, the standard will first become mandatory for prime market listed companies with a market capitalization of 3 trillion yen or more, starting from the financial year ending March 2027. And then they'll apply to companies with the market capitalization 1 trillion yen or more from the financial year ending March 2028. And then companies with the market capitalization of 500 billion yen or more will follow, starting from the financial year ending March 2029. And finally, for other listed companies, the standards are expected to become mandatory sometimes in the middle of 2030s. Regarding the forced labor-related regulation, while the EU has already introduced enforceable regulations such as forced labor protection ban regulation, Japan has not yet proposed similar regulation. However, a related guideline has already been issued. In August 2022, Japan published a guideline for respecting human rights in responsible supply chain aimed at helping companies operating in Japan identify and prevent human rights of violence in their global supply chain. This guideline focuses specifically on human rights due diligence and do not address environmental due diligence. It applies to all companies regardless of size or industry. This guideline encouraged business to develop human rights policies, conduct human rights due diligence, set up a grievance mechanism, and disclose relevant information to stakeholders on an annual basis. This guideline is not legally binding and their application is entirely voluntary. Now I'd like to move on to sustainability reporting requirements in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has also amended its existing stock exchange listing rule to require the disclosure of non-financial information. Overseas companies may be also subject to these regulations if they issue securities or become listed in Hong Kong. Under these rules, the Corporate Governance Code found in Appendix C1 mandates the disclosure of information such as board diversity. The ESG reporting code outlined in Appendix C2 includes both mandatory disclosures and comply or explain requirements. The comply or explain approach means the issuers must state whether they comply with specific provisions. But if they not, they are required to explain how they are addressing the underlying governance objective through the alternative means. Part B of Appendix C2 set out the mandatory disclosure requirements, including details on governance structures, reporting principles, and the scope of the report. Part C covers 12 categories of environmental and social issues that fall under comply or explain framework. These include a wide range of areas such as emission, resource use, climate change, employment practice, labor standards, product responsibility, and anti-corruption efforts. In 2024, the rules was amended to introduce Part D, which set out climate-related disclosure requirements aligned with IFRS S2. The amendment came into effect on 1st January of this year. The and makes the disclosure of Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emission mandatory. This slide summarizes the effective date for a climate-related disclosure obligation under the Hong Kong Stock Exchange listing rule. Starting with the financial year beginning on or after the 1st of January 2025, all issuers will be required to disclose Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions. For other climate-related disclosures, including Scope 3 emissions, the requirements vary depending on the types of issuers. From financial year beginning on or after the 1st of January 2025, all main board issuers will be subject to comply or explain requirements for these disclosures. Furthermore, the large cap issuers, this disclosure will become mandatory 1 year later from financial year beginning on or after 1st of January 2026. As for GEM issuers, disclosures remains voluntary at this stage. Lastly, Hong Kong also published its own sustainability disclosure standards on December 12th of the last year. These standards are fully aligned with the ISSB standards issued by the IFRS Foundation. As with the ISSB standards, they are divided into S1, which covers general requirements for the disclosure of sustainability-related financial information, and S2, which focus on climate-related disclosure. The new standards known as the HKFRS will take effect from August 1st of this year. A phased approach of mandatory implementation is currently under consideration. Financial regulator in Hong Kong plan to require larger listed company to adopt HKFRS S1 and S2 by 2028 at the latest. That is from me. Now I'd like to hand it over to Sid, who will explain the overview of India.
Thank you for a great presentation, Yuko. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brief overview of sustainability regulations in India. I will be sharing some interesting developments which happened in this year. But first, I would like to set the stage by going over the main sustainability reporting rules in India. The Business Responsibility and Sustainability Reporting Circular, also known as BRSR, mandates disclosures from listed entities based on their adherence to the 9 principles of the National Guidelines on Responsible Business Conduct. Reporting under each principle is categorized into essential indicators, which are mandatory, and leadership indicators, which are voluntary. Companies are encouraged to report on the leadership indicators. Each principle includes indicators that are categorized as essential and leadership. Now, some examples of principles that business should adhere to, which are considered essential, would be respect and promote the well-being of all employees, including those in their value chains, promote human rights, and make efforts to protect and restore the environment. Now, if I may kindly request you to hold on to these principles because slides 2 and 3 are based on them. A final point under the BRSR framework in India is that companies are required to disclose Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions as part of their BRSR reports, which are mandatory for the top 1,000 listed companies. Scope 1 emissions are direct GHG emissions from sources that are owned or controlled by the entity. Scope 2 emissions encompass indirect greenhouse gas emissions from the generation of electricity purchased by a company. Scope 3 emissions are currently considered voluntary disclosures. Earlier, in March 2025, the Securities and Exchange Board of India published a circular on introducing a new leadership indicator on green credits under Principle 6 of the BRSR core framework that businesses should make efforts to protect and restore the environment, which we just discussed in the previous slide. But first, Let's familiarize ourselves with the concept of green credit. The Green Credit Program, GCP, is an initiative by the Government of India to encourage industries, companies, and other entities to undertake voluntary environmental measures resulting in the award of green credits. While traditional carbon credits primarily target greenhouse gas reduction, green credits encompass a broader range of environmental efforts such as tree plantation, water management, waste management, air pollution reduction, eco-mark labeled development. This created the basis for a market-driven framework where individuals, companies, and institutions can acquire auditable, certifiable, and tradable credits. GCs earned may be mentioned under the ESG leadership indicator as per applicable rules. Appropriate recognition shall be accorded to the green credit applicant who earns significant quantum of green credits. As ESG standards and climate finance tools align globally, India, through SEBI's leadership and its National Green Credit Program, is emerging as a pioneer among developing nations in linking sustainability performance directly to financial and reputational benefits. ESG commitments extend beyond a company's immediate operations, with the value chain presenting a significant challenge. The entire process, from obtaining raw materials to delivering the products, involves suppliers, distributors, and logistics partners who all impact a company's collective ESG footprint. Value chain reporting details all the activities, resources, and relationships a company uses to create and deliver its products or services from the initial idea to the consumption and end of life. Consider this example. An electronic product manufacturer may ensure ethical labor standards in its factories, but if its suppliers rely on child labor in sourcing critical minerals, its social S performance under ESG is thereby compromised. Earlier this year, SEBI streamlined the reporting of value chain partners, VCPs, under BRSR Core. Companies are now only required to report on VCPs that individually contribute 2% or more to their total sales or purchases by value. This revised threshold aims to ensure that companies focus their disclosure efforts on the most significant relationships within their value chain. The value chain encompasses various elements, including internal operations, supply, marketing, and distribution channels. This includes activities like sourcing materials, external environment. This refers to the financial, geographical, geopolitical, and regulatory contexts a company operates within. During the first year that companies report ESG disclosures for their value chain, reporting the previous year's figures will be voluntary. For example, when reporting for financial year 2025 to 2026, disclosing data from financial year 2024 to 2025 won't be mandatory. Last month, the Indian Ministry of Finance and the Department of Economic Affairs issued the draft Climate Finance Taxonomy Framework. As a tool, the Climate Finance Taxonomy helps identify activities which are consistent with India's climate action objectives and its net zero by 2070 pathway. It seeks to channel more resources into climate-friendly technologies and endeavors, thereby supporting the nation's 2070 net zero vision and guaranteeing long-term access to reliable, affordable energy. The taxonomy will categorize activities and projects into two groups: climate supportive and climate transition. Examples of climate supportive activities include avoiding greenhouse gas emissions, reducing emissions intensity, deploying adaptation solutions that reduce the risk of adverse impacts of climate change. Climate transition activities involve projects and measures designed to boost efficiency and lower emission intensity in sectors where completely avoiding emissions or adopting alternative technologies isn't currently feasible. In conclusion, recent developments such as the introduction of green credits and the streamlined value chain reporting for significant partners underscore India's innovative approach to linking sustainability with tangible benefits and manageable disclosures. With that, I'd like to thank you for listening and introduce my colleague Alex, who will take it from here.
Thank you very much, Sid, for that brilliant introduction. Now let's move on to ESG reporting and supply chain due diligence in South Korea. I'd like to start from introducing you to the ESG reporting framework in South Korea, which emerges from governance disclosure to ESG disclosure. First, back in 2019, South Korea published the Corporate Governance Disclosure Guidelines, which is applicable to all Korean-listed companies from 2021, which are required to disclose governance information in line with the 10 core principles outlined in the guidelines. It focuses on protection of stakeholder or investor interests, and mostly on the disclosure of internal governance structures. In 2021, South Korea published the ESG disclosure guidance. This is a voluntary guideline for all Korean-listed companies who wish to disclose their ESG-related information. And the topic it covers from issue selection and report design to the verification and reporting of the actual information. In 2023, a draft act on ESG to support sustainable management was introduced in the Korean parliament, which proposes to require public disclosure of ESG information. Companies may seek certification under this bill, and if they are certified in terms of the ESG information they have disclosed, they would be entitled to support from the government. So at the moment, ESG reporting in and of itself is still voluntary in South Korea. Nevertheless, South Korea is also in line with the adoption of IFRS sustainability reporting standards. This is also categorized into 3 different standards, similarly to Japan, but not necessarily the same in terms of the contents of the standards. So KSSB 1 is modeled on IFRS S1 and is on general requirements for ESG disclosure. It is proposed to be a mandatory standard, and it takes a climate-first approach. What it means is that non-climate risks are to be reported on a topic-by-topic basis, decided by reporting entities themselves. It also requires the disclosure of the date of authorization and the person responsible for ESG disclosures. So it would contribute to greater transparency. KSSB 2 is on climate-related disclosures modeled on IFRS S2, and is also proposed to be a mandatory standard. It covers reporting of scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions, although the timeline for the actual reporting of scope 3 disclosure is still pending consultation results. It also highlights industry-based metrics for this disclosure of GHG emissions, and also focuses on companies' internal carbon prices. Interestingly, Korea has introduced KSSB 101 as an additional policy-aligned disclosure standard, which is proposed to be voluntary. So the idea is that companies may disclose how their actions have been aligned with government-related ESG-related policies, and then they will be entitled to certain compensations from the government. So the consultation period for all of these draft standards have ended on 31st of August last year, and on the 30th of December 2024, the Korean Financial Services Commission have indicated in a press release that the final versions of all of the standards will be published in the first half of 2025, which we're still expecting. Next, we move on to the topic of illegal logging and supply chain due diligence. Korea has developed a framework of sustainable use of timber based on a series of acts and regulations. So the act, the enforcement rules, and the presidential decree were all introduced back in 2012 or 13, and have been amended several times. And the most major requirements stemming from the act and the regulations is the due diligence requirement regarding the verification of the legality of the harvest of imported timber through the import declaration system, and also the promotion of sustainable use of timber for manufacturers by selecting them by grade. Korea has also been pioneering in terms of its focus on broadening the idea of ESG or responsible business practices. So we have seen this in the publication of the guidelines on business and human rights back in 2021. So this is a voluntary guideline that covers various areas of business and human rights, including labor and employment, supply chain due diligence, human rights and affected communities, etc. And it also introduces industry-specific implementation of human rights due diligence guidelines for companies to comply with. Now let's move on to ESG reporting in Singapore. It should be noted that Singapore has yet to introduce any supply chain due diligence regulations or voluntary guidelines, which is likely due to the fact that there is not a lot of manufacturing activities happening in Singapore. So we'll focus on ESG reporting instead. So for the current rules of ESG reporting in Singapore, they have been updated last year in 2024 and have now been fully aligned with the IFRS standards. It also takes a climate-first approach, which means that the application of IFRS S2 on climate disclosures and also the climate-related provisions in IFRS S1 will be implemented first, and company will also take a comply or explain approach for all of the other primary ESG reporting components. Singapore is also pushing for the phased implementation of the disclosure of carbon emissions. So for scope 1 and 2 emissions, they will be required to be reported first, and the timeline for scope 3 emission reporting is still under review for all issuers. Singapore is also more in the idea of expanding the reporting obligations to private companies. So climate disclosures for for what's called large non-listed companies is supposed to begin in financial year 2027, but this is still expected and not finalized. So now let's take a look at the expected timeline for climate disclosures in the entirety of Singapore. We can see the different timelines for listed issuers and large non-listed companies. The only timeline that has been finalized and implemented is the financial year 2025 deadline for carbon emissions of scope 1 and scope 2 for the listed issuers. The others are still expected and not finalized. Finally, let's look at ESG reporting and supply chain due diligence in Vietnam. The corporate ESG disclosure in Vietnam is governed by Circular Number 96 of 2020, and it covers public companies and requires annual reporting of the following items. It should be noted that the notion of public companies in Vietnam also encompass non-listed large companies. So this requirement goes beyond only Vietnamese stock issuers. And the component of the disclosure include key greenhouse gas emissions metrics, as well as sustainable resource use, environmental practices, labor policies, and also actions towards affected communities. Companies are also encouraged by the circular to apply globally accepted standards in their reporting. The latest development in this regard from Vietnam is the ESG Disclosure and Implementation Handbook published in October 2024. And at the moment, Vietnam still has no plan to adopt any IFRS-aligned standards. For the issue of illegal logging in Vietnam, it is governed by the Circular Number 26 of 2022. which is titled Management and Traceability of Forest Products. I wouldn't go into too much detail of this circular, but just to highlight the key requirements here is still related to supply chain due diligence in terms of certification and record keeping to ensure the legal harvesting and use of timber in Vietnam. With all that being said, I would like to direct your attention to a couple of key takeaways. I have summarized to the best of my abilities the key takeaways to 2 points. The first one is on climate disclosures, and more specifically, the development status of IFRS aligned national standards in all of the jurisdictions that we have covered today. So for China, Japan, and Hong Kong, they have issued national standards that are highly aligned with IFRS sustainability standards. These are all currently voluntary, but they are expected to become mandatory in the future. For South Korea and Thailand, they are still in the process of finalizing their national standards in this regard. And for India and Vietnam, they have not yet indicated any plans, but they have their own ideas of developing national ESG reporting frameworks. And the second point I would like to highlight is that the Asia jurisdictions that we have covered today are gradually shifting away from a climate-focused disclosure framework to a more comprehensive ESG regulatory framework. So for example, we're seeing Thailand, India, South Korea, and Vietnam are already enforcing ESG reporting regulations that encompass non-climate information, including corporate governance, business responsibility, and human rights. Japan and Hong Kong have also amended their existing regulations and rules to mandate disclosure of certain sustainability-related information. China and Singapore have also pushed for a voluntary, at the moment, disclosure of non-climate sustainability information. And we are also seeing regulations and guidelines moving toward broader ESG-focused issues, including supply chain due diligence, sustainable resource use, and also human rights and affected communities. So this goes beyond only climate disclosures. And in fact, therefore, it is absolutely important to use regulatory tracking and horizon scanning tools like C2P to stay on top of all the new developments. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Orla.
Thanks a million, Alex, and Lynn and Sid and Yuko for that really insightful presentation. And thank you all for your attention so far. As mentioned at the beginning, we now have the floor open for the Q&A session. So again, if any of you have a question that you would like us to answer, please let us know by using the Ask a Question widget to the left side of your screen. We have a few questions coming in already during this webinar, so we'll aim to answer a few now. The first one is, you have covered the recent developments in ESG regulations for China and Hong Kong. Could you provide an update on any ESG regulatory changes for Taiwan?
I think I can take that question, Orla. That's Lynn here. Yes, Taiwan has also been very active in the ESG realm. For instance, the Taiwanese Financial Supervisory Commission has issued a proposal for amendment to several aspects of the regulations which govern the information to be published in annual reports of public companies. And this will be aligned with the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards. And listed and over-the-counter companies will have to disclose sustainability report related financial information in phases starting in 2026.
Perfect. Thank you, Lynn. Another question. Is there any other Asian country that has implemented or signaled their intention to implement the IFRS sustainability standards besides the one you discussed?
Thanks, Orla. I can take that. So at the moment, there are also a couple of other Asian countries that we have not covered that have either adopted or proposed to adopt the IFRS standards. So for example, Malaysia, the Securities Commission Malaysia have released the National Sustainability Reporting Framework on the 24th of September last year, which deals with the use of the IFRS standards S1 and S2 as the baseline for sustainability reporting and assurance in Malaysia. and also Sri Lanka. The authorities in Sri Lanka have issued 2 sustainability disclosure standards last year as well, which are just localized versions of the IFRS standards. So these 2 countries have already adopted IFRS S1 and S2. And for countries that I have proposed to adopt the standards, I would just name the 2 countries, Indonesia and Pakistan here, without going into too much detail. But yeah, there are other countries that I have also acted in this regard.
Great, thanks, Alex. Are companies required to disclose Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions in Japan?
Thank you, Ola. I can take that. So thank you for that question. Currently in Japan, disclose of Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emission is not mandatory, but the SSBJ plans to make such disclosure mandatory in future. So once it's implemented, companies will be required to disclose their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And in addition to that, the SSBJ will mandate companies to disclose Scope 3 emissions as well under this standard. So while the TCFD only recommends and without requiring the disclosure of Scope 3 emissions, Japan might require to disclose their Scope 3 in future.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Yuko. And we just have one here as well with respect to India. What are the advantages of green credits to companies?
Thanks, Ola. I can take that one. So firstly, green credits earned may be mentioned under the ESG leadership indicator under BRSR rules. Secondly, upon successful verification, participants will receive certificates of green credits, which can be traded on a market platform, offering financial incentives for their efforts. Lastly, and this may not be applicable to everyone, but it's worth mentioning that the tree plantation taken under Green Credit Program may be swapped for compliance of compensatory afforestation in case of diversion of forest land under the Indian forest rules.
Brilliant, thanks, that's it. And I'm just conscious of the time, so we'll leave the Q&A session there. But again, any questions at all, please do ask them in the Ask Question widget, or else you can reach out to us directly after the webinar if you think of it afterwards. But with that, I just want to say thank you all for tuning in with us today. We hope you found today's presentation helpful, and we hope to see you in our upcoming webinars. You can check out our resources section on the website to stay updated and to access our latest white papers, blogs, and webinars, both on demand, and you can register for any upcoming webinars that we have. We have plenty of upcoming content, so make sure you keep an eye out. Our next webinar, Navigating the Digital Product Passport, What Are Your Compliance Obligations, is scheduled for June 18th. So we hope to see you there too. And an appendix of the comprehensive summary of the ESG policies, alongside with the slides you've seen today and the questions from the Q&A, will be shared with you all after the webinar. And again, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you soon.